It's real. It's real. You know the deal. You know the deal. Come on.
Hey, it's Shantae.
And I'm Natalie. And welcome to What's the Deal, a podcast powered by the Norfus Firm. At the Norfus Firm, we solve people problems, and we have the great pleasure of working with companies all around the world on HR and DEI initiatives. This time I didn't look at you and you still made me laugh. Like we clown before we get on, y'all, because we try to get fun. The energy up. Yeah, and we just have fun because we like the people we work with.
Yeah.
And that didn't work. I actually laughed saying my own name. All right, so we have been talking about workplace beef for this is 5 episodes.
Yes.
And workplace beef for shared language purposes is also, it's beef at work. And then it's workplace conflict that we're talking about. And so we've talked about creating an understanding of where your workplace is and whether you are fertile ground for conflict. And largely we recommend figuring that out through workplace culture assessments. And we have an episode on how we do them. We're very intentional about those assessments. And so hope you check that out. And if you haven't done one, give us a call because we can help you. And then we've talked about some types of conflict that have come up. We have in the US, as we're filming, we're about a month and a half away from the presidential election. So we've talked about conflict that can come up with politics involved. We've also talked about the fact that sometimes people think conflict is related to race, gender, disability, which is certainly always possibilities. And sometimes it's related to just pure personality conflict. We've also talked to you about how to solve the conflict through facilitation, which is something else we're really skilled at. Call us if you need that too. Today, we're going to talk about the types of conflicts that lead to needing an investigation. And we've heard me talk about investigations a lot.
I feel like that's the apex, like the peak of it all.
The apex
is if you have to call in an investigator.
Dun, dun, dun. I need a badge. I need an investigator badge.
I'm going to find one. Reagan, we need to, yep.
I need a badge.
The sheriff.
The sheriff.
Chief
but actually not a sheriff. Yeah, we don't want me to. That's actually interesting. You don't want to confuse an investigator with a cop because the way cops do investigations is very different.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Than the types of investigations.
Well, let's get into it then. Okay. I like how you did. You're smooth as we get into our shared language. Hit it. So what's an internal investigation? And then tell us what an internal investigator is.
Internal investigation typically comes out of someone raising some sort of complaint at work. And the types of complaints that typically will lead to the need for an investigation are, I've been discriminated against, I've been harassed, I've been bullied, I've told a boss that something's illegal and they still want me to do said illegal thing. I saw someone steal something or they're embezzling money, right? Some violation of a workplace rule. Typically, there's some event that has happened.
Keep beating up that mic.
Beating up the mic.
She's in, yep.
That there's a problem that's happened that's implicating a rule, a law, or a process.
Okay.
That you can't just talk it down. And so the investigation itself is looking into said complaint and trying to determine whether or not it has merit. So if someone's coming in and saying, I've been sexually harassed by my boss, he keeps telling me that if I don't have sex with him, I won't have hours or I won't get a promotion, right? So my job is to go in and understand, did the boss flex power and try to get sex out of a worker and make that conditioned on making sex a condition of future employment opportunities. So that's the job of the investigator, which is me, someone who knows how to dig into the problems and not just dig into the problems, understanding the implications of said problems, right? I've said a lot. I'm in my lawyer mode.
Well, it's funny that you say that.
For notwithstanding.
Because I think that helps though.
Yeah.
Because lawyers aren't the only ones who can do investigations, right?
Correct.
But it helps to have that legal background.
Well, it's interesting because I do the same introduction every time I meet a new witness and explaining my role, because I understand, and my intro is actually getting longer and longer, mainly because I'm walking into a lot of situations where the trust is so low. Yeah. And I need for people to be able to tell me what's happening. So I like to tell people who I am. I always say I'm a lawyer, but I'm not anyone's lawyer here. So I understand employment law, but I don't represent your company and I don't represent any employee. Mm-hmm. I like to let people know that I'm a lawyer because there is a power imbalance. Oftentimes, if I'm not talking to another lawyer, that I have information, I know some stuff about stuff they don't know. Yeah. And I want to be clear about that because I don't want to ever take advantage of it or have them, more importantly, have them feel like they're being taken advantage of. Right. And then I also explain a little bit about the work we do at the Norfus Firm, because when I'm walking into these investigations, I have workplace culture and HR expertise and DEI expertise, and I have legal expertise. Sometimes they cross over, but oftentimes they're different types of expertise, mm-hmm. right? They don't always go together. Right. So I let people know I'm coming in that way, like with that background. But to your point, you don't have to be a lawyer to be an investigator, but you should understand harassment and what the elements of it are. You should understand discrimination, what the elements of it are. You should understand workplace bullying and the elements of it are. You should also understand what your processes are, because that's what you're investigating against. Mm-hmm. The reason why that's also important is because when you do an investigation, just like when we do a workplace culture assessment, just like when we do a facilitation, people are going to bring up a whole lot of stuff that isn't the thing you're investigating. Right? So people will, you might be interviewing them about a harassment claim, and then you're like, you know what? And I have worked 10 hours overtime and I haven't gotten paid for it. And you're like, oh, okay, hold on. Wait a minute. Let me really get my extra pen out for that, because that's not what I'm here for. I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost in the sauce. Mm-hmm.
So we are starting this, well, we wanted to center this conversation around specifically what's going on with senior leaders. Oof. Because we've gotten a lot of calls, I'd say within the last year and a half even, if not more, where a lot of the conflict is happening at that really high level. Mm-hmm. So it's not even like the line employees or mid-level management. It really is at that senior leader. And so when that breaks down, it's like, oh my goodness, what's going on here?
First time we got some conflict involving senior leaders, a CEO and a president with others of a company, was April of 2021.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so the way that it's increased since then, mm-hmm. I think in 2 weeks, we just had like 4 people call for that. And so, yeah.
Now, when we say senior leaders, who exactly are we talking about?
Usually it's going to be like your VPs and above, right? Your C-suite, your CEO, your chief human resources officer, your CFO. We've had conflict involving all of those positions, unfortunately. And to me, and I'm curious, so you and I have actually never talked about this, mm-hmm. what I'm about to say, mm-hmm. but to me, it's kind of frightening mm-hmm. because it's like, who's in charge?
Running the place?
Who is in charge? We have said that to ourselves in certain situations, but it's scary because you're just like, why aren't you guys getting along? And what is happening?
And even if they're not getting, how did y'all let this break down to this point where you can't even do the work?
You know, it's an interesting thing. I still, and I know people are probably sick of me in my soapbox, but I do think it's some outcome of the pandemic and the level of pressure mm-hmm. that leaders have been under always, but certainly since March of 2020, of trying to keep a business going with people having to be, if you're white collar workers out of the office and working from home, how do you deal with your frontline workers who might be exposed to, to coronavirus and all of the rest, all of those things. And like we never did anything to like pause and grieve and get it together. So I would imagine that's a good part of what's happening is it's this leftover sludge. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody, if you look, I know I still haven't, but I know you've watched Succession. Mm-hmm. And some of these things are real true. Like people are gunning for jobs and they do stuff and there's backstabby and like those things have always happened, right? We've always had that.
The power struggles.
With the mic also, right?
Struggling with the mic.
Yeah. But so the point is like
power struggle with the mic.
The point is like there's always some level of competition or things that happen at that senior level. I mean, and it makes sense. I mean, it's hard to get to those levels if you're not a little bit competitive and willing to like, elbow folks out of the way to, get where you need to get. But golly, when things break down, it's like they won't even talk to each other. You're like, yo, you have to run this whole company. How are y'all not even going to speak?
It's tough. I mean, so you also have, I think, an element of culture that might play into that, and also some generational things that might show up as well, just because of for most companies, when you get to that senior level, you're of a certain age, within a certain age group. And so maybe the folks right underneath you or others coming up might be a generation underneath, who knows? And so there might be some issues that come up there and are at play too. So, which
I think is why, if you're looking at the types of claims that I investigate, especially that involve senior leaders, there's so many elements of DEI that overlay. And as I've been saying to people a lot lately, a lot of my complaints lately are not even straightforward legal complaints. They do have a heavy amount of DEI overlay of, that CHRO is not well-versed in DEI. How could she possibly lead HR if she doesn't understand all the various layers of, I've gotten a number of those complaints. And so then it becomes like you have to be thoughtful of all of these demographic issues that can come into play. And again, we'll get into the senior leader. We'll keep digging on the senior leader. But this just happened in an investigation I'm doing where a new leader came in a production context. And as I'm listening to everyone, I'm like, there's an age thing going on here because the manager is much younger than the folks complaining. There's geographical issue because the complainants were from one part of the country and the manager from another, and you could see the geographical differences. There was race/cultural differences in terms of approach and how they were talking to each other, right? So I'm in my brain, I'm like, gosh, it's like a matrix. I'm always want to talk about a matrix. Anyway, so I think it's just this is why if you're not dealing with folks who are well-versed in DEI principles, you're also not necessarily going to get the best outcome of your investigation.
Speaking of outcomes, what is like an ideal outcome from an internal investigation?
Well, I mean,
is there an ideal outcome?
Really? There you go. The lawyer answer. You know, I was going to say it depends. Yeah. It depends. I mean, look, the ultimate goal is to understand what happened, right? No matter what the happening is.
Right.
So I always describe investigations like someone taking an 800-piece puzzle and like dumping it on my desk, and I'll be able to put together about 600 of the pieces, right? Because these things need to happen quickly, as quickly as possible, because they're disruptive to a workplace. And I like to move as quickly as possible to not interfere with day-to-day operations. So I may not get every single piece of that 800-piece puzzle, but enough to be pretty clear about what's happening. So that's the first thing, because I think a lot of times when we get the phone calls, people are not entirely clear, like, well, what did happen? And they always seem like they got along and I never knew they had this kind of issue, right? Especially with senior leaders, because it usually has been festering for a while and then it starts to bubble up once it's already past a point. So people are shocked, like, oh my God, I never expected that they had this issue with each other and the like. So I think the what happened is usually the first thing people want to understand. And then, the rest of it is like, if the happened is, they were discriminated against. No, they weren't, but they took something the wrong way and I could understand how they saw that, or whatever the case may be it's everything that flows from that starts from the what happened.
And so if we think about it, if we go back to the senior leader part of this, what's the impact? Like we got to it, we started it, and then we went off on a tangent, but coming back to it, like what's the impact on the organization if you have your senior leaders?
Well, you're typically ending up hearing how it shows up in all the rest of the work that their respective teams do. Unfortunately, what we've seen in assessments we've done is the disdain that a leader has for a colleague ends up getting communicated sometimes very directly to the team, which is always kind of bizarre to me, because it's like, why would you tell your team you don't like your colleague or your C-suite colleague, and that, because then it trickles down, and then it develops a narrative, to use one of your words, of like, oh yeah, John's team, they're dumb, they're not going to know what they're talking about. out. We're just going to have to work around them. We're just going to have to go over to this team and ask them to backdoor it and the like.
Right.
And it creates these very dysfunctional practices around silos, around information hoarding, around power hoarding, right? And so it has really deleterious effects. I wanted to put in a word that I feel like you would have been
Very proud of that word.
Yeah.
It's a great word. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it has like tentacles.
So at that level, what's going on? Like when you're talking to these people, senior leaders at this level, how are they showing up typically?
Well, that also depends. You know, it's interesting because it runs the gamut, right? I think to the generational thing, people who are more senior in their careers and more senior in age, there's still this like facade that usually comes through where they're speaking in this very corporate talk about like, I'm straightening my back for this one. Like they're this corporate talk on this is that we aligned on and agreed on and aligned and aligned and aligned. And then she did this and that was not what we aligned on. Right. And it's this whole like, and you're like, okay, but what's underneath it? You have other leaders who are raw with it from the beginning, right? That person talked to me crazy. I try to talk to them about it. They continue to do it. They continue to go behind my back. So they show up a lot of different ways. And then I think the more extremes are folks who like won't look you in the camera or like looking down the whole who have other sorts of things going on where, you know, you're not getting straight answers or being able to get anywhere with. And it's because of the fact that we have the vantage point of doing workplace culture assessments, watching it too is like, oh, okay, I see how this started, right? Like you can see like where that's an issue. And so, but what's your view on senior leader conflict? I mean, you've seen a lot of it too. Like what is your view on what's happening?
Let's see. My view on what's happening with senior leaders. They're under a lot of pressure. And you would hope, I think it's something that happens earlier in their career. Because what we're hearing a lot of is folks aren't getting the training and the development that they need in order to really assume these positions. And it starts when they're in middle management, and I think it just continues on as they move up through the leadership.
Ascend. You were going to say ascend.
Thank you for catching that, because I was like, it starts with an A. As they ascend through leadership. And I think that sometimes the development isn't quite there. And it's not just the technical development in terms of doing the job, but it's more, as you get into your leadership roles, it's really about how the self-awareness, it always comes back to the self-awareness, the emotional intelligence. How are you then showing up and leading others? And then how are you running this enterprise? So I think if you don't have a solid foundation there, it can really impact how you lead, and then the relationships that you develop with the leadership team that you're supposed to work with. So I mean, people have blind spots, and I think they don't even recognize the gap, what's missing in terms of their own development and how they're showing up as a leader in order to really be able, that shows up in the relationship that they have with someone.
I think 95% of the time we're dealing with workplace conflict between senior leaders, whether we're doing a facilitation or an investigation. It comes down to the how, not the what, right? So people are not typically fighting about what they should be doing. They're fighting about how to do it. Yeah. And so if you think about it from a perspective of someone who's risen to like a VP level because of the output.
They're really good at their job.
But no one's really taken a time to say, well, how did you do it? A lot of times they've scorched the earth to get that output because they didn't have the tools of how to like bring people along and do all the things. So it's the how part that gets most people in trouble. Yep. You're not thinking about how to talk to people. You're not thinking about how to include them. Right. You're actively excluding them because you think that their opinion is different than yours. And you don't want anybody having a different opinion than yours, although having a different opinion might get to a better result than yours. Yeah. Right. And it comes back to that self-awareness for sure. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's really also, investigation means things have completely boiled over. You're at a point where people are either not talking to each other, resisting talking to each other.
And they filed a formal complaint, right?
Like they filed a formal complaint.
That's tough.
So that means, like, again, there's a bunch of steps that were skipped potentially before we even got to this point. Because these are things that you can try to figure out before they happen. Like if you think about a CEO and their C-suite, their direct reports, what kind of team building and leadership building and skill building are you all doing together?
Right.
How are you all creating a space or a container for each other?
Right.
Is it safe to be in front of the CEO and say, listen, I asked Shantae to help me with this 6 times. She said she would. She never showed up to any meeting. I don't know how else to solve this, but this is where we are. Or do you have a culture where the CEO is kept in the dark, which we see a lot? Right. We can't let the CEO know that there's this problem for whatever reason. Like it's an interesting thing. We implore people to go and like be curious about, like, what kind of culture do you have as a C-suite? Because that
definitely impacts the rest of the organization. The leadership culture has a direct impact on the workplace culture. Right. To your point earlier, where it trickles down, definitely. So they need to get that together. if they don't have it together already. So just real quick, as we come to the end of this, are we coming to the end? I think we're at about that point, possibly.
I mean, we're getting there.
Felipe said 5 minutes.
Okay.
Wrap it up. So I don't know, do you have a view into what happens after you've conducted the investigation and you wrapped it up and like delivered what you needed to deliver to your contact? What happens after that?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I appreciate you bringing that up because I think, we're big on communication. And so again, I try to be very clear about my role and in terms of like who I am and who I'm not. And it's really important to make sure people understand they have a right to complain. They have a right to talk to me so they can't be fired or otherwise impacted. And then we get to the end and I am always clear, somebody will have to close this out with you. Sometimes it's me.
Right.
People ask me to close out the investigation, but way more often than not, it's the employer, and the employer should be closing out. We heard the concerns. We brought someone in. They finished. We got our findings. To the person to whom made the concern, you want to let them know whether or not their claims were substantiated or not and what you're going to do about it.
Right.
The level of information you give everyone else depends on, what they need to know. And so in terms of what happens after, it's been an interesting mix because about 4 or 5 years ago, it was really standard protocol that when I would do an investigation report, I would put in recommendations. This is what I would do if I were you. And then I talked through it with the person I'm giving the report to. But then I realized that it probably could really set an employer up for failure to put in recommendations that they may not even be willing to take.
Right.
Because if there's ever a lawsuit and the report that I wrote becomes front and center, someone who's an expert in all these things is saying, this is probably what you want to do, and they don't do it. I mean, that doesn't bode well. So I'm not here to set people. I mean, it's not a setup. It's really just trying to understand what happened. So oftentimes when I'm giving the report, people will say, well, what do you think we should do, or whatever the case may be is. And so then we've had many investigations where we then are retained to help further with HR support and how to implement some of the solutions that have been recommended.
Or and to do a deeper assessment, like that's turned into that.
Correct.
That actually went into the culture assessment.
Correct.
Yeah.
Like we've helped there. And then there's sometimes where I have no idea what happens. I do the report, they say, thank you very much. And then right off into the sunset, which is actually less common. Just I get called for the same companies, more than once and the like, but I will say I really love when I get to stay and help because you've gotten some insight into sort of what's happening and, we love to solve problems. So I'm always like, oh, I can help. But then, you gotta wait for what they need. Yeah, of course.
Awesome. I think we're there.
Yeah. All right. So investigations arise when people raise complaints that have a legal or a policy implication, and that's the investigation itself is needed in most places to preserve certain defenses if you ever get sued. So there's a real legal reason to do investigations. You should want to do them anyway if you have problems arise, because as we always say, be curious about what's happening in your workplace. It's important to figure out the type of investigator. Again, you don't have to be a lawyer, but you certainly want someone who's skilled. And when you've reached the level of C-suite folks not getting along, you certainly want that person to be neutral, right? Especially because sometimes one of the C-suite members who has a problem is the head of HR. Mm-hmm. So it's important to be thoughtful of when you would need an outside investigator versus someone who might be trained to do so inside. Goal is to figure out what happened. Got to make a decision. A lot of times people just do an investigation and they don't come to some kind of conclusion. Like, you have to close it out, meaning come to a conclusion and let people know what's happening. And then, of course, try to take some action on preventing these same types of conflicts from arising in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. Do I get to close this out today? Awesome. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for being with us. This was a lot of fun. We really covered a lot today in this whole series, actually, from top to bottom. So check it out again. It's, what are we calling it? Workplace beef?
Beef at work.
Beef at work. Yeah. And so go check it out. And if you want to find more, learn more about us, find us, retain us, help you out, we are at thenorfusfirm.com. You can check out the podcast by going to the podcast page at thenorfusfirm.com. Which will take you to YouTube. Yes, take you to YouTube, which is, thank you for that, because I missed that the last time. So we're on YouTube. We're also on LinkedIn and Instagram and as The Norfus Firm. And then we're on Instagram and TikTok as What's the Deal. You went from not saying anything to getting really specific. Anyway, we'll be back. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Here it is. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership. That's the deal when you know what you're dealing with.